The small town of Watauga in the Appalachian Hills had never seen a night like this. The thick summer air hung heavy, suffocating the quiet streets as the sun dipped below the ridgelines. The cricket songs and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds that filled the void. Behind the weathered wooden walls of the Fletcher family's cabin, the brothers sat in silence, each one grappling with their own thoughts. John Fletcher, the eldest at 34, leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire. His face, a hard map of years spent in the mountain's unforgiving soil, was lit by the glow of the flames. His thoughts were far from the crackling warmth. Tomorrow, Rennie Dixon was going to hang. Rennie wasn't family, but in this town, that meant little. Rennie had killed a government informant, and now, for the crime of upholding mountain justice, he was paying the ultimate price. "You think they'll do it?" Earl's voice broke the silence. He was the middle brother, 2 years younger than John, with a strong jaw and a look in his eyes that seemed to question everything. He sat at the table, a hand running over the smooth handle of his hunting knife. His words were more of a statement than a question. "Sheriff Harris is the law, and the law is going to do what the law does," John replied, his voice low, carrying the weight of someone who had been fighting the law all his life. His mind kept returning to Rennie, his old friend. He had grown up alongside him, worked the land together, and it stung like salt on an open wound to think that come dawn, Rennie would be gone. "But they don't understand," John muttered to himself, mostly lost in thought. "They never did." Jimmy, the youngest at 27, spoke up from the corner. Jimmy had always been the quiet one, observant and quick to act when needed. "The law don't care about what's right around here, only cares about their rules." John's eyes narrowed as he looked into the fire. He knew this. He had seen it too many times. The government didn't care about the mountain code. They didn't understand that to take someone's livelihood, their family, their way of life, wasn't something that could be taken lightly. A thought simmered in his mind, an idea that had been growing over the past few weeks as the feds encroached more and more on their territory. It was one thing to take Rennie's life, but it was another to tear down their entire way of life. It had to stop. "I'm not letting them get away with this," John finally said, the decision settling in his chest like a heavy stone. His brothers looked at him, the weight of his words hanging in the room. Earl leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" John looked at them, eyes cold and determined. "We're not letting Rennie die alone. We're going after the lawmen tomorrow. After they hang him, we make them all pay. No one does this to us." A hush fell over the room as his brothers took in the gravity of what John was proposing. "We make them pay," Jimmy echoed, nodding slowly. The plan was simple. They would hunt them down, one by one, lawmen who thought they could control the Fletcher family. By the time the sun rose over the mountains the next morning, the Fletchers would no longer be silent. They would be a force, and nothing, not the law or any government power, could ever take them down. The cabin was quiet again, but this time the air was filled with anticipation. John, Earl, and Jimmy sat in a tight circle around the table. On it, maps of the area were spread out, marking the lawmen's patrol routes, the buildings they frequented, and the paths the brothers knew like the back of their hands. The night before, they had discussed the mission at length. Now, It was time to put it into action. John's mind was sharp. He had lived in the mountains his whole life, and he knew that knowing the land was their greatest advantage. They could slip in and out of the shadows, unseen and unheard, just like ghosts. "We strike at dawn," John said, his voice steady. "We move fast and quiet. Take out the ones who'll be stationed at the hanging site first." Earl nodded, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table. "Sheriff Harris and his men, we can't waste time. They'll be watching the town square at first light. But after the hanging, they'll be spread out. We can hit 'em while they're scattered." Jimmy, who had always been the one to execute the plans, didn't need convincing. "We'll use the ridge lines, cut through the trees, come in from behind. They won't hear us until it's too late." John pointed to the map, marking key locations. "We know where they'll be. The sheriff's office, the courthouse. We'll need to hit them fast, just as they're breaking up. No hesitation." There was no turning back. The brothers knew the risks. Their small mountain community had been under the watchful eye of the government for months, and now the law was within striking distance. But for John, the decision had already been made. "We'll take 'em one by one," John continued. "We hunt them down and make sure no one forgets what happens when you mess with a Fletcher." Earl and Jimmy both gave a silent nod. It was clear that they too had made up their minds. This wasn't just about Rennie. This was about making a stand for their family, for their father, and for the mountain code they lived by. "We don't just kill 'em," John said. "We make 'em understand what they've done. We'll leave no trace of mercy. They'll remember the Fletchers for what we do next." The plan was simple, but the consequences were monumental. Tomorrow would not just be the end of Rennie Dixon's life. It would be the beginning of a new chapter for the Fletchers. One where they took justice into their own hands, and no lawman would stand in their way. As the brothers sharpened their knives and prepared their rifles, the mountains outside seemed to echo their resolve. The Fletchers would rise from the shadows, and they would not stop until they had what was owed to them. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning fog clung to the mountain ridges, a thick shroud that seemed to slow time itself. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting weak beams through the mist. For John Fletcher and his brothers, the day had come. The time for talk was over. Today they would make the lawmen feel the weight of their decisions. John stood at the edge of the cabin, his rifle resting against his shoulder. He looked out over the land he knew like the back of his hand, every tree and stone a part of him. The fog swirling around the mountain had a calming effect, but underneath, the blood in his veins was thick with anticipation. "It's time," John said, turning to Earl and Jimmy, who were already suited up and checking their weapons. Each of them had their own way of preparing, but they all knew the mission. They knew what they were about to do, and the consequences that would follow. Earl strapped on his revolver, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't the thinker in the family like John, but his instincts were razor sharp. He was the first to act, the first to pull the trigger when it was necessary. Jimmy, younger but equally dangerous, was already loading his shotgun, the metallic click echoing in the quiet morning air. The Fletchers had no plans of mercy for the men they were after. The lawmen had overstepped, thinking they could come into the mountains and control the people who had lived here for generations. The brothers were going to show them that no one could trample on the mountain code without paying the price. The first lawman they had to deal with was Deputy Bill Sims, a brutish man who had been stationed near the hanging site the day before, overseeing the crowd and ensuring the execution went off without a hitch. Sims had always been an obstacle for the Fletchers. He didn't understand the mountains, the people, or their way of life. To him, they were just criminals. John and his brothers had been tracking Sims for weeks. They knew his routine, his favorite spots, and even the way he moved when he wasn't expecting trouble. Today, they were going to turn that knowledge into a deadly advantage. Jimmy, you and Earl cover the west side. I'll take the east, John said, his voice cold but steady. We hit him fast. No hesitation. We don't want him getting the chance to scream. With a nod from both brothers, they set off through the trees, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who had been hunting their whole lives. The woods were their home. And now, they were hunting the ones who dared to cross them. It didn't take long to find Sims. He was just as they had expected, standing by a rock outcrop, his back turned as he checked the town below. It was the perfect opportunity. John signaled to his brothers, and in that instant they sprang into action. Jimmy and Earl flanked him, taking positions on either side of the outcrop. They moved swiftly, closing the gap between them and their target without a sound. Sims never saw them coming. A sharp crack broke the silence as Earl fired his revolver, hitting Sims in the shoulder. The deputy's body jerked violently, but he didn't fall. Instead, he turned, eyes wide with fear, reaching for his sidearm. It was too late. Before Sims could make a move, John's shot rang out, a clean hit that sent the deputy to the ground, his rifle falling from his hand. "First one's down," John said, his voice steady but tinged with a grim satisfaction. They quickly moved to hide the body, dragging Sims into the underbrush. No one would know they had been there. They had made their point. The lawmen who had come to oppress them would learn that the mountains had their own kind of justice, and it wasn't something that could be ignored. As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, the Fletcher brothers moved deeper into the heart of their mission. The woods that had provided solace for generations now felt like a battlefield. The blood they had spilled was still fresh on the earth, and the taste of vengeance hung in the air. John had always been the calm, methodical one. He was the leader, the planner, and he knew that each decision they made from here on out would be a step towards something irreversible. They couldn't go back. There would be no undoing what they had done. But there was still more to be done. Sheriff Harris, the man at the top, was next on their list. He was the one who had given the orders, the one who had sentenced Rennie Dixon to death. Harris was more than just a lawman. He was the symbol of the government's intrusion into their lives. If they were to send a message, it had to be Harris. The brothers had been tracking his movements for days. He was no stranger to the woods, but unlike Sims, he wasn't as careless. Harris had been a mountain man in his younger days, but he had lost touch with the land in recent years, trading his rifle for a badge. His arrogance had made him believe that he could be a part of both worlds, the law and the mountains. But John knew better. The lawmen in these hills never understood the people they were meant to govern. "Today, we make sure Harris knows what happens when you mess with a Fletcher," John said, a deadly edge to his words. As they approached the sheriff's cabin, the brothers took up their positions. Earl and Jimmy would flank him, while John would take the shot. They knew Harris would be in his cabin, most likely resting after the morning's events. He thought the town was safe, that The hanging had closed the chapter on the Fletchers. He couldn't have been more wrong. "We wait for the signal," John told his brothers. "When I fire, it's over." The minutes dragged on like hours, the silence growing heavy between them. They watched the cabin from their positions, their breaths quiet but deliberate. As the sun rose higher, casting its warm light on the cabin, the moment they had been waiting for came. Harris stepped outside, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. His back was turned to the brothers, and he stood with his arms crossed, completely unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond his sight. John took a deep breath, steadying his rifle. He knew this shot would be different. Harris wasn't just a lawman. He was the one who had broken the Fletcher code, the one who had crossed the line. The crack of John's rifle shattered the silence, a clean, sharp shot that rang through the air. Harris collapsed, his body jerking forward before crumpling to the ground. "Done," John said, his voice low but resolute. As they moved toward the body, the brothers felt the weight of what they had done settle over them. This wasn't just revenge. It was a message. The law had been warned. The Fletchers were a force to be reckoned with, and no one would stand in their way. The mountain justice they upheld would never be silenced. The Fletchers moved through the woods like shadows, their pace deliberate, their footsteps quiet as the morning fog began to lift. They had taken down Sheriff Harris, but the fight was far from over. The lawmen in the region had been too complacent, too sure of their power. They needed to feel the full weight of what the Fletcher brothers were capable of. And they wouldn't stop until the entire system understood that. John Fletcher walked ahead, his rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning the tree line. The air was thick with tension, each breath a reminder of the line they had crossed. The mission wasn't about justice anymore. It was about survival, about defending their way of life no matter the cost, no matter who had to die. "Two more," Earl said, his voice breaking through the silence. His dark eyes met John's, the gravity of the situation settling in. "We know where they'll be." Jimmy, the youngest, moved beside them, his movements steady and practiced. Despite his age, he had the same unflinching focus as his older brothers. "We finish this now," he muttered, checking the ammunition in his shotgun. The next two targets were Deputy Walter Grant and Deputy Joe Baker. Both men were known for their ruthlessness in handling people like the Fletchers. They had been at Rennie Dixon's hanging, both playing key roles in the execution, ensuring that the town stayed under control and that the Fletcher brothers never stepped out of line. The thought of their arrogance, their belief that they could dictate the fate of the mountain folk, made John's blood boil. The brothers made their way toward the last known location of Deputy Grant. They had heard rumors that he had taken refuge in a nearby cabin, his nerves frayed from the previous day's events. It was the perfect time to strike. They reached the cabin just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the landscape. The old creaky wooden building sat isolated, tucked deep in the hollows, where the trees grew thick and dark. There was no one else around. It was quiet, eerily so, save for the rustling of the leaves and the distant call of a hawk. John motioned for his brothers to take their positions. Earl would cover the front, Jimmy the back, and John would wait for the signal to take the shot. His heart pounded, his mind calculating the moments before Grant's life would end. Inside, they could hear movement, muffled footsteps, and the creaking of wood as Grant paced in agitation. The brother's breath synced with the rhythm of his footsteps, waiting for him to make the fatal mistake of letting his guard down. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Deputy Grant stepped onto the porch, unaware of the danger closing in. His hand rested on his holster, his body tense as he scanned the quiet woods. He was a man who thought he was in control, but control had slipped through his fingers the moment he stood in the Fletcher's sights. John's rifle shot echoed through the mountain air. The deputy's body jerked back as the bullet struck him square in the chest. He fell backward, his mouth open in shock, his life snuffed out before he could even understand what had happened. The brothers quickly moved to hide the body, making sure no trace of their presence remained. The lawmen, one by one, were falling, and the mountain would soon be theirs again. But as they moved through the woods, the weight of their actions settled on John's shoulders. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about protecting something greater than themselves. It was about their family, their land, and their way of life. "We're not done yet," John said quietly, as they moved deeper into the woods. The silence was heavy, but there was a sense of finality in the air. They were close now. Soon the last deputy would be taken care of. The sun had set fully by the time the Fletcher brothers approached the final location, the cabin of Deputy Joe Baker. This cabin was tucked on a steep ridge, one that overlooked the valley below. It was a spot that Joe Baker, a man who prided himself on his ability to watch over his domain, thought would be a safe haven, the perfect place to regroup after the chaos of the previous days. But as John Fletcher led his brothers toward the cabin, there was no sense of safety. It was only a matter of time before Baker realized that he was next. The lawmen, for all their bravado, had underestimated the Fletchers and their resolve. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from logs and stone. It was surrounded by a patch of overgrown thicket, providing the perfect cover for the brothers to approach unseen. The last remnants of daylight clung to the sky, casting an orange glow over the mountains. It was the kind of evening that made the land feel timeless, untouched, yet at the same time full of ominous energy. John motioned for Earl and Jimmy to take their places. Earl would keep an eye on the ridge. Jimmy would approach from the east while John would handle the shot. This was it. The final lawman who had come too far into the mountains. They moved closer, each step deliberate and quiet. John's heartbeat echoed in his chest as he neared the cabin. They could hear the low murmur of voices inside, and from the sound of it, Deputy Baker was not alone. He had someone with him, perhaps a friend, perhaps another lawman. It didn't matter. This would be the end for both of them. They waited. And in those moments, as the minutes dragged on, John couldn't help but think back to how they had arrived here. The murder of Rennie Dixon, the hanging that had set everything in motion, the loss of their father to the law. Everything had led to this moment, to the crossroads of vengeance and survival. And now there was no turning back. Finally, the cabin door creaked open. Joe Baker stepped out, his hand on his rifle, scanning the woods around him. He was tense, on edge. He had heard rumors that someone was out there, but like so many lawmen before him, he had dismissed the threat. He was the law, after all. No one was going to touch him. It was at that moment that John took his shot. The rifle cracked through the air, and Joe Baker dropped to the ground before he even had a chance to raise his weapon. The sound of his body hitting the earth was drowned out by the echoes of the shot. Earl and Jimmy quickly moved into position, making sure there were no other threats. The brothers approached the cabin where they could hear muffled voices inside. They were too late to stop the inevitable. Baker had been their last target. As they moved forward, John couldn't help but feel a flicker of regret, a sense of what could have been. But the moment passed quickly. They had made their stand, and now there was nothing left to do but finish what they had started. The quiet of the mountains seemed to hold its breath after the Fletcher brothers had completed their grim work. With the fall of Deputy Joe Baker, the mission was over. The lawmen who had come to their land had been wiped out one by one, as if erased from existence. The Fletchers had become both avengers and ghosts in the landscape they knew so intimately. Now they would disappear as swiftly as they had come. John Fletcher stood at the edge of the cabin, his rifle slung across his back. He looked out over the valley below, the shadows of the trees stretching long into the night. The sun had set hours ago, and the chill of the mountain air wrapped around him like a cloak. The brothers had completed their vengeance, but there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of closure, only emptiness. The weight of what they had done hung heavily on John's shoulders, but he knew they had no other choice. "We've made our point," John said, his voice low and tired. The violence was over, for now. But the consequences would echo for a long time. Earl and Jimmy stood next to him, equally silent. They had fought beside him, trusted his leadership, and followed him into the heart of darkness. But they, too, felt the quiet aftermath of their actions. "We're leaving, right?" Earl asked. His face was hard, unreadable, but his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "They'll come after us, John. The law won't just forget this." "I know," John said, his eyes narrowing, "but we've made sure they won't forget us either. They'll know who we are now, what we stand for. They won't come looking for us, not after what we've done." Jimmy remained quiet, his eyes scanning the horizon. His gun was still in his hands, but his grip was loose, as if he had already started letting go. It was over, and yet it wasn't. The brothers had won this fight, but there would be no real victory in their hearts. What they had done couldn't be undone. "We head west," John said, breaking the silence. "To the next town. We'll lay low for a while. They'll be searching for us, but we've got time. They won't find us unless we want them to." The brothers nodded, understanding the necessity of their departure. There was no place left for them in Watauga, not after what had happened. It was time to disappear into the shadows, just like the ghosts they had become. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the mountains seemed to swallow them whole. The dense trees, the mist rising from the earth, it all felt like a part of them now. It was a place of refuge, a place where justice could be taken into their own hands. But the peace was fleeting. Nothing would ever be the same. John took one last look at the cabin, the place where they had carried out their mission. The door stood ajar, the wind gently pushing it back and forth, as if it too was ready to move on. Without another word, the Fletcher brothers turned their backs to the cabin and disappeared into the night. The world outside the mountain was vast and strange. It felt like stepping into a different life. The Fletcher brothers had lived their whole existence in the shadow of the Appalachian ridges, and now they were leaving it behind. The weight of their actions followed them, silent but suffocating. They knew that they had crossed a line, but what did that really mean? What kind of men had they become? John Fletcher, though resolute in his decisions, couldn't shake the quiet questions that echoed in his mind. His eyes flickered to the road ahead, the worn path that led them away from the only life they had ever known. Their heads were low, their eyes vigilant. Even though they had won their battle, they hadn't escaped the consequences. The law would soon catch up with them. It always did. But for now, they had to keep moving. They knew better than to linger. In the distance, the next town loomed, a place that promised anonymity, a place where no one knew their names, and the past could be forgotten, at least for a while. "We'll make it," Jimmy said, his voice breaking the silence. He was walking alongside Earl, the two of them seemingly in step, their eyes scanning the horizon as they moved. The weight of the mission was still on them. But there was something freeing about this moment, the silence that followed the storm of violence. There was no one left to fight, no more lawmen standing in their way. For a moment they felt as if they could breathe. John glanced at them. "We have to keep our heads down. We don't stop. Not until we're out of this state." "We keep moving west?" Earl asked, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Yes," John replied firmly. "We're going as far as we need to go. The law can't catch us if we don't stop moving. They'll be looking for us, but we'll be gone by the time they start." The brothers walked in silence for a while longer, the weight of the night still pressing on them. They had taken the law into their own hands, and now they had to face the consequences, whether they liked it or not. But as the moonlight bathed the landscape, the path before them seemed to stretch on forever, full of uncertainty and fear. They knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back now. The price of their silence, the silence they had earned through blood and rage, would follow them wherever they went. And for the first time, John felt a pang of regret deep in his gut. This was no longer just about Rennie, about defending their land. It was about something much larger, something they could never fully escape. But for now, they had no choice but to move forward. The mountains had swallowed them once. Now they would disappear into the wide world, chasing the last remnants of freedom they could find. It would be a hard life, but it was the only one they had left. The night had been long, but the next morning came too quickly. The Fletcher brothers had made their way far from the town, deeper into the wilderness of North Carolina. With every mile they put behind them, the reality of what they had done began to feel more distant, but it never fully left them. The brothers were bound to the past by an invisible thread, the blood they had spilled, the lives they had taken. Each step farther from the mountains brought a new weight to their hearts. As the sun rose, casting its first golden light over the rugged land they had crossed, John Fletcher paused to take in a deep breath. The morning air was colder than usual, the wind biting with the sharpness of impending winter. He could feel the chill in his bones, but the cold didn't bother him as much as the quiet that hung between them. For days they had been moving from one place to another, taking back roads and hidden trails that most people would never know about. The quiet was unnatural, unnerving. They hadn't spoken much since the killing of Deputy Joe Baker, each brother lost in his own thoughts. Yet the reality of their circumstances weighed on them all. "Let's find a place to rest," Earl said, his voice thick with exhaustion. He had been quiet lately, his usual gruffness tempered by something deeper. Guilt, perhaps, or something harder to name. The morning had stripped away any remaining comfort from the land. The brothers had traveled without a destination, a quiet surrender to the unknown. They had no plan, no refuge. John nodded, but it was clear that there was more at play than exhaustion. His sharp eyes flicked to Jimmy, who had been staring at the ground as they walked, lost in thought. "You all right, Jimmy?" Jimmy didn't look up immediately. The question hung in the air for a moment before he responded, his voice low. "I'm fine." John wasn't sure if Jimmy was lying to him or to himself, but he knew better than to press him. They had always kept their distance from one another, bound by blood and loyalty, but not by the closeness that some families had. The Fletchers had always been about survival first. "We'll keep going until we find a place to lay low," John said. "No stopping for too long. We can't afford to stay in one place." Earl's eyes flicked toward the distant horizon. "You think they're still looking for us?" "They're not giving up that easily," John replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "The lawmen we killed were part of something bigger than just a few mountain sheriffs. This will be remembered." A moment of silence passed between them. The implications were clear. The Fletchers were wanted men now, marked for death or imprisonment. The law would not rest until they were caught. But in that silence, something else stirred. It wasn't just the law they were running from. It was the ghosts of what they had done, the heavy truth of their actions, the lives they had stolen. John took a long look around, feeling a quiet resolve form in his chest. "We do what we have to," he said finally. "We're outlaws now, boys. This is the life we chose." Earl nodded grimly. "Then let's make it count." The brothers continued on, their footsteps steady as they disappeared into the woods, their hearts heavy but determined. They were no longer men of the mountains. They were fugitives, ghosts in a land that had once been their own. The world outside was vast, but the brotherhood between them, forged by blood and vengeance, was what they could count on. The hunt was not over. Not for them, not for the law. It was only just beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the Fletcher brothers found themselves deeper in the mountains, further removed from the town they once knew. Their path had taken them to the outskirts of a small town on the edge of the Appalachian foothills, a place they hoped would offer some respite. It was quieter here, a place where people were too busy with their own lives to worry about the whispers of fugitives on the run. The brothers had been careful, living off what they could find and hunting when necessary. They kept to the shadows, avoiding the main roads and anyone who might recognize them. But it was harder than they expected. They couldn't outrun the law forever. Even in the isolation of the mountains, there was always the risk of being discovered. John had always been the most pragmatic of the three. He knew that their current situation could not last forever. Every day they spent in hiding made the chance of capture more likely. But what choice did they have? There was no going back. They had crossed a line, and now they had to survive the consequences. "We need to keep moving," John said one evening, sitting by the fire as Earl and Jimmy sat across from him, eating the small meal they had managed to catch. The fire flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows over their faces. "We're not safe here." Earl looked up, his brow furrowed. Where are we going, John? We can't keep running forever. John shook his head. We'll head west. We find a town far from here, maybe even cross the state line. We'll keep moving. The longer we stay in one place, the more chance we have of being found. Jimmy, who had been quiet for most of the evening, spoke up. And what if they find us before we get there? What if they're already on our trail? They won't find us if we don't make ourselves a target, John said, his voice sharp with authority. We lay low, keep our heads down. The law doesn't know where we are. They won't be able to track us if we're smart about it. Earl grunted, clearly not convinced. And if they catch up to us? John's gaze hardened. Then we fight. There was a long pause as the brothers absorbed his words. They had already done things they could never undo. Violence had become a part of who they were. It was no longer just about revenge. It was about survival. And if the law was going to hunt them down, they would make sure it wasn't an easy hunt. Earl nodded, his expression grim but accepting. We've come this far, ain't no turning back now. Jimmy, his eyes darkened with exhaustion, stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing, looking out at the night. What happens if they catch us? What happens then? John rose and walked over to him, standing side by side with his younger brother. If they catch us, Jimmy, we face the music, but they won't catch us. We won't let them. Jimmy didn't respond, but his gaze softened. He understood. They had made their choice, and there was no turning back. The brothers had crossed into a life they could never fully escape. The mountain justice they had enacted had set them on a path of no return. The night pressed in around them, and for the first time in weeks, John felt the weight of what they had done settle heavy on his chest. It wasn't just the law they had to worry about. It was the toll that living as fugitives exacted on the soul. They had traded their former lives for this one, a life on the run. And there was no certainty in the future, only the constant struggle to survive. Tomorrow, they would move again. The hunt continued. The brothers would run, fight, and survive. But the question loomed in John's mind. How much longer could they keep this up? The days blurred together as the Fletcher brothers moved farther into the Appalachian wilderness. Their journey had taken them through thick forests, winding mountain trails, and isolated cabins. They were ghosts moving in and out of the shadows, always one step ahead of the law, but not always ahead of the consequences of their actions. The violence they had unleashed had left a mark on their hearts, and no matter how far they traveled, the weight of their decisions remained. The world outside the mountains seemed distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. The brothers no longer spoke of the towns they had passed through or the lives they had once lived. All that mattered was survival and the unspoken understanding that there would be no return. The lawmen they had hunted were no longer just figures of authority. They had become symbols of everything the brothers had fought against. But despite their efforts to stay hidden, John knew that it wouldn't be long before their past caught up with them. The Fletchers weren't just hunted by the law anymore. They were hunted by something more dangerous. Fear. Fear that anyone they crossed paths with could be a threat. That one wrong move could expose them to a world that had already branded them as outlaws. The brothers had found a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes, but it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for them. John had been thinking about this constantly. He had always known the law would come for them, but there was something else gnawing at him, a feeling of unease that had crept into his bones. Earl was the first to notice it. One evening, as they sat around the fire, the crackling flames casting long shadows across their faces, Earl stood suddenly, his hand on the rifle beside him. His gaze was fixed on the dark woods that surrounded them. "You hear that?" Earl asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. John's eyes narrowed as he listened. There was something unsettling in the air, a silence that felt too heavy. The usual sounds of the night, the calls of owls, the rustling of leaves, were missing. "I don't hear anything," Jimmy said, his voice sounding unsure. Earl took a step toward the edge of the cabin, his rifle now in hand. "I know I heard something. We're not alone." John stood up slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He didn't need to hear anything to know that they weren't safe. The mountain was full of people who lived by their own rules, but there was no loyalty here, only survival. The brothers had made enemies, and it wouldn't take much for someone to turn them in for a bounty. "Stay alert," John said, his voice steady. "Whoever's out there isn't looking for us to share a meal." The air was thick with tension as they scanned the surrounding forest, their senses heightened. Every creak of a branch, every flutter of a leaf, felt amplified in the silence. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each second dragging, as if it would never end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Earl lowered his rifle. "I didn't see anything. Must have been the wind." But John didn't share the same relief. There was a presence, something he couldn't put his finger on. They had crossed a line, and now the price for their revenge was more than just the law. They had made enemies in every direction. "We keep moving tomorrow," John said, his voice hard. "The longer we stay, the more chance we give someone to find us. We don't stop." The brothers gathered their things in silence, their minds racing. John could feel the weight of the past pressing on them, could hear the distant footsteps of the lawmen who would come for them, just as he knew there would be others, locals, bounty hunters, anyone who had a reason to claim the price on their heads. They were never truly safe, not anymore. They had made their choice. But the consequences of that choice would haunt them wherever they went. The unseen enemy was always lurking, and John Fletcher knew that one day they would face it. As the weeks turned into months, the Fletcher brothers continued their trek westward, leaving behind more and more of the life they had once known. They had grown accustomed to the constant vigilance, to the restless nights spent watching for danger, but there was a deep part of John that longed for peace. For a time, he believed that they could outrun the world, that they could find a place where their past wouldn't catch up to them. But that place didn't exist, not anymore. One evening, after a long day of traveling through the hills, the brothers found a secluded spot near a fast-moving stream. It was a place they had passed through before, a peaceful corner of the mountains where the sound of the water was the only noise to be heard. It felt like an oasis of calm in an otherwise turbulent life. John sat down on a boulder, his back against a rock wall, and watched the water flow past him. The world felt different here, quieter somehow, as if the mountains had decided to let him rest, just for a moment. But the peace was fleeting. Earl and Jimmy had made camp nearby, setting up a small fire and preparing their evening meal. John glanced over at them, watching as they moved in silence. They were tired too, and yet they had learned to live with the weight of what they had done. "John," Jimmy said, breaking the silence. He sat next to him, his voice soft, but edged with a quiet urgency. "You ever think about what we've done?" John didn't immediately respond. He could feel the question hanging between them, the unspoken truth that lingered in the air. He knew what Jimmy was asking, but it wasn't something he wanted to face. "We've done what we had to," John said finally, his voice low. "What they did to Rennie, what they did to us, we had no choice." "I don't know, John," Jimmy replied, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "I've been thinking about it more and more. You said we were protecting our land, our family, but look at us now. We're running. We're not even living anymore." John looked at his brother, his eyes hardening. "What else was there to do? You think we could have just let them hang Rennie and walk away?" Jimmy fell silent, staring into the fire. "I don't know. I never thought it would come to this. We're not the same men we were before all this started." John's mind wandered back to the early days, to the simpler times when life had been about working the land, about family, about survival. It had all seemed so straightforward then. But now, the path ahead was obscured by the shadows of their past. "We're still the same men, Jimmy," John said, his voice quieter now. "We're just changed. And no matter what happens next, we have to live with it. There's no going back." The fire crackled between them, its warmth a small comfort in the cold night. But John knew that the fire couldn't burn away the guilt, the regret, or the fear that lurked deep inside him. The price of their survival was more than they had ever anticipated. They had killed, had betrayed the codes of honor they had once lived by, and now they were paying the price for it. "Where do we go from here?" Jimmy asked softly. John stared into the flames, his mind clouded with thoughts of the future. "We keep moving. We survive. That's all we can do now." Earl, who had been listening from the other side of the fire, stood and walked over. "What about the law? They're not going to forget about us, John. It's just a matter of time before they catch up." John looked up at his brothers, his gaze steady. "They'll never catch us if we don't let them." The mountains were their home, but they had lost everything else. And no matter how far they ran, the past would always follow. The price of survival for the Fletcher brothers was more than just blood. It was the cost of becoming the very thing they had once fought against. The wind howled through the ridgelines as the Fletcher brothers trudged through the dense Appalachian woods. Their journey westward had led them further into unfamiliar territory, places where no one knew their names. But the weight of their past never seemed to leave them. They had become phantoms in the land, their every step a whisper in the wind, their presence as inevitable as the setting sun. Yet, despite the miles they put between themselves and the law, the burden they carried grew heavier with each passing day. John Fletcher led the way, his rifle slung across his back, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around them. His mind was a labyrinth of thoughts, some of them practical, others filled with an ache he couldn't shake. He had become a man of action, a man who lived by the code of survival. But deep inside, he couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt that now haunted him. Was this life worth it? Was revenge worth the destruction it had wrought on them all? "John," Earl's voice broke through his thoughts. The middle brother was walking beside him, his pace steady but his face etched with fatigue. "We've been on the move for weeks now. When do we stop?" John glanced at Earl, seeing the tiredness in his eyes. It was more than just physical exhaustion. It was the toll of the life they had chosen. They had kept moving, never stopping long enough to catch their breath, always one step ahead of the law and anyone who might recognize them. But for the first time, John began to feel the weight of it. The constant flight, the constant pressure. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running. "We stop when it's safe," John replied, his voice low. "We keep moving until we find a place where no one knows our names." Earl didn't respond, but his frown deepened. He understood the weight of John's words. There would never be a true place of safety, not after what they had done. The lawmen they had killed, the families they had destroyed, the lives they had altered forever. There was no escaping that. As they continued on, they came across a small clearing by a creek. The brothers made camp there for the night, their fire flickering low in the dark. The distant stars above seemed so far away, and the only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind. They sat in silence, their minds heavy with the burden of their choices. "We can't outrun this forever," Jimmy spoke up from the shadows. His voice had the quiet, contemplative tone that John had come to recognize. Jimmy was always the most introspective of the three. "The law will come. They'll catch up to us eventually." John looked at his youngest brother, seeing the strain in his eyes. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but until then, we keep moving." Earl shook his head. "But where do we go, John? We can't just keep running. We have no life anymore. We're not even men. We're just fugitives." John clenched his jaw, the words stinging. He knew the truth in Earl's statement, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. He had led them into this life, and now there was no way back. "We fight to survive," John said, his voice hardening. "We've made our choices, and now we deal with the consequences. We don't stop." The fire crackled as they sat in silence, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. The night felt colder somehow, the chill seeping into their bones. They were running, but where would they go when there was nowhere left? To hide? The weight of the future pressed down on them, and John realized, for the first time, that the price of survival wasn't just the blood on their hands. It was the price of never truly being free again. The days that followed were a blur of endless roads and hidden paths. The Fletchers had become increasingly weary, not just physically, but emotionally. The miles stretched on before them, and with each passing day, the strain of running grew harder to ignore. They had crossed state lines, found themselves in unfamiliar towns and forests, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering when the law would find them. John's nerves were taut, his thoughts never still. He had become a man defined by his actions, a man who took what he wanted by force. But as the days wore on, that certainty began to erode. He had once believed that vengeance would set them free, but now he saw the truth. It had only made their lives harder. He had always believed in justice, but what kind of justice had they brought upon themselves? What had they truly gained? One evening, as they passed through another small town, John noticed something that set his instincts on edge. The people here were different. more watchful. The town was quiet, but there was a sense of unease in the air, something that didn't sit right with him. The brothers had always been able to sense when danger was near, but tonight the feeling was sharper, more immediate. "We need to get out of here," John muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the streets. Earl and Jimmy both turned to him, sensing the change in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" Earl asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. John didn't answer immediately, but instead he walked ahead, motioning for his brothers to follow. They had learned long ago that when John said it was time to move, there was no arguing with him. As they rounded the corner, they saw a group of men standing near the town square. John could tell by their posture that they were lawmen, maybe local marshals, but there was something different about them. They didn't look like they were just passing through. They were watching for something, watching for someone. "We've been spotted," John said, his voice low and urgent. Earl's hand instinctively went to the revolver at his hip, but John stopped him. "Not yet," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied the men. They were getting closer. John's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the tension mounting. He knew that running was their only option, but part of him couldn't shake the thought that this could be it, the end of the road. The law was closing in, and no matter how far they ran, there would be no escaping it forever. "Time to move," John said, his voice hard as stone. The brothers turned and disappeared into the shadows, their hearts racing, the fear of capture never far behind. It was only a matter of time before the law caught up with them, and as the Fletchers vanished into the night, they knew that they were living on borrowed time. The world they had once known, the land they had fought to protect, was slipping through their fingers. In the end, there would be no place left to run. The price of their survival had been steep, and soon it would come due. The Fletchers had found themselves at a crossroads. They had lived like shadows, moving from one isolated place to the next. But with each day that passed, the law drew nearer. The brothers' instincts were sharp, but the world around them was getting smaller. No matter how fast they ran, the consequences of their actions were catching up. John felt it most of all, the weight of what they had done, the inevitability of what was to come. The time they had spent in the mountains, escaping the law, was running out. They had made it this far, but how long could they outrun the world they had created? They had made their decision to fight for survival, but now they could feel the walls closing in. The lawmen were spreading. The news of the Fletcher brothers' killings had traveled further than they anticipated. Every town they passed through now seemed to be watching them. Even the air felt charged with danger. John was growing tired of the constant evasion. The brothers had been hunted by fear for so long that it had taken a toll on them, physically, mentally, and emotionally. "We can't keep running forever," Earl said one evening as they sat by a dying fire. "We don't have a choice," John replied, his voice carrying a rare uncertainty. "We've come this far, but we can't go back. We'll keep moving." But deep down, John knew they couldn't escape the reckoning. They were outlaws, and the law would soon catch up with them. The question was no longer if they would be found, but when. The brothers stood at the edge of a small clearing, the town barely visible in the distance. They had made it this far, but they could feel the end approaching. Their lives, once defined by the mountains, were now defined by the blood they had spilled and the enemies they had made. John turned to his brothers. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the truth. "We fight, or we go down trying." Earl nodded, gripping his revolver tightly. "We've always fought for what we believe in." Jimmy, quieter than usual, looked at the horizon. "But at what cost, John?" John didn't have an answer. They had fought, but they had also lost everything in the process: family, land, and their own peace of mind. Now they were cornered, and there was no way out but through. They heard the distant sounds of the lawmen approaching, their footsteps crunching on the leaves, their voices low but determined. This was it. The Fletchers would face what they had wrought. John took one last look at his brothers. "We stand together, no matter what." As the lawmen closed in, the Fletcher brothers prepared for their final fight. The price of their survival would finally be paid, but they would go out on their own terms. The lawmen surrounded the clearing, closing in on the Fletcher brothers from every direction. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the trees, the crackling of twigs, a clear signal that there was no escape now. John Fletcher stood tall, his rifle held steady. His heart raced, but his resolve remained firm. "This is it, boys," he muttered under his breath. Earl and Jimmy were beside him, ready. There was no fear left in their eyes, only a grim acceptance. They had run long enough. They had fought for everything they believed in. But now it was time to face the consequences. "Together," John said, his voice low but resolute. The lawmen were almost on top of them now. It was too late to run. The Fletchers would fight until the end, knowing they would never make it out alive. But they would not surrender, not to the law, not to the fate they had chosen. The air was thick with tension as the first shot rang out. The brothers fired back, their hearts beating with the last remnants of defiance. But the end was inevitable. And so, with guns in hand, the Fletchers made their final stand. The sound of gunfire faded, leaving only the eerie silence of the mountains. The lawmen stepped cautiously into the clearing, finding the bodies of the Fletcher brothers, 3 men who had fought for their family, their land, and their code of justice. John Fletcher, Earl, and Jimmy had fallen, their blood staining the earth beneath them. The law had finally caught up with them. But it was clear that the Fletchers had never gone down without a fight. The lawmen stood over the bodies, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They had done their duty, but they couldn't ignore the feeling that they had also destroyed something much bigger, a piece of the mountain's soul, a piece of justice that was more than just the law. The Fletchers were gone, but their legacy lived on in the stories whispered through the Appalachian hills. They had become legends, symbols of resistance, and reminders that sometimes the cost of survival was greater than anyone could imagine. In the end, the Fletchers had paid the price for their choices, but their story would live on in the hearts of those who understood the old ways, and in the mountains that had always been their home.